Good evening, everyone. It really is a privilege to be here this evening. Thank you. Thank you for our worship team for leading us in those songs. I didn't know the second one before, so it was a beautiful song. Lovely choice. It really is a privilege to be here this evening. I'm really glad to be here. Newbold holds a special place in my heart. I had a really good, thorough, robust, rigorous experience here. The academics were... I'll tell you what I've heard other people say. I know other people who have studied at different institutions around the world, Andrews, different places, and have also studied at Newbold. And I've heard them all say that Newbold gave them the kind of courage and emboldened them to kind of think independently and to learn in a different way. And that was certainly my experience. Like I really was challenged in the best possible way. Thanks to Dr. Caro for letting me come. I think the very first interaction I had with any member of staff here on campus was with Dr. Caro, and he taught me classes, missiology classes and stuff, and I think Newbold's in the best possible hands, in your hands, Doc, so really glad that it's under your leadership, and thank you to Danilo for your patience. He asked me a number of times to come, and there was always something that kind of prevented me from being able to come, and I was just saying to him before, this time I had to say yes, because it was getting to a point, it was just going to seem rude. It was going to seem like I was just disrespecting him, and it was never that. So thank you for your patience, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you to the speakers who have spoken the previous evenings, and today's Thursday, so that means we are about 70% alive. By Sabbath, we're going to be fully alive, right? So tomorrow and Sabbath, you're going to be blessed by someone who's actually one of my closest and one of my oldest, maybe even my oldest friends, Pastor Lolly Fontaine. She's going to be here with you tomorrow and Sabbath, and I know you're going to be in really good hands. So I'm glad to be able to kind of precede her and warm you guys up. So really pleased to be here with you this evening. Some of you I know, some of you I don't know yet and hope to know. Some of you, as Danilo said, you've come and preached for me already, and I'm grateful. Steve, thank you. Some of you are due to come soon. Adam, thank you. And some of you will still be due to come, I just don't know you yet. But when I know you, I'll bring you if you're willing. I'd love to give you an opportunity. So I just invite you to bow your heads with me at this time, and we'll pray. Dear Father in heaven, honestly, I feel really privileged to be able to stand here at this point, to be able to speak to your people who I hope can feel like my people who have given me a warm welcome and invitation. You know the time that we've spent wrestling with these ideas. I pray you'll help me to do justice in a clear and accessible way to things that you've placed on my heart that I think are important for us to be able to grapple with. So please go before us now. In your name we pray, amen. Does anybody remember the first piece of music that they ever owned? Anyone remember? To be fair, some of you are going to be thinking, owned? Who owns music now? No one buys music, but does anybody remember the first piece of music that you owned? Was it an MP3? Was it like a digital file? Okay, thank you, love it. It was a CD. Okay, compact disc, right. So some of you maybe use MP3, some of you CDs. Cassette tapes, anybody? Ah, okay, now we're talking. Some of you look too young for cassettes to be the first piece of music that you own. I can remember the first piece of music that I owned, and it wasn't any of those formats. It was on vinyl. It was on vinyl. And I could give you a million guesses, and you would never guess what that first piece of music I owned was. So I'm going to put you out of your misery. No, that would be less embarrassing than what it actually was. No, it was the first piece of music I ever owned was a song by Bart Simpson called "Do the Bartman." And what you have to understand, first, I don't know if I need to say this, I was about 9 or 10. I wasn't an adult when I bought that, first of all. When I was a kid, The Simpsons had kind of just recently come out. And it's kind of difficult now to kind of stress how big The Simpsons was when it first came out. It was huge. Bart Simpson was everywhere, and he had this song called Do the Bartman. And before you judge me too harshly for having terrible taste, there's a couple of extra points of note. First of all, this song was #1 in the charts. Back when charts were actually based upon kind of purchases and radio play, this song, it was huge. It was #1. And secondly, Michael Jackson provided the backing vocals on this song. So it wasn't just a nothing song. This was like a huge hit. That was the first piece of music that I bought, and it was on vinyl. And Do the Bartman was the A-side on this particular piece of vinyl. So what that means, it was the main song on the record, because with vinyl, you can play both sides of the piece of vinyl. Not like CDs where you can only play one side and the other side's got the artwork and the name. With vinyl, you can play music on both sides. And so there would be, Do the Bartman was the A side, and there was another song, which I can't remember, that was on the other side of the vinyl, and that song would be known as the B side. And that was kind of like a bonus song. Because there was more space on the vinyl still, we may as well put something else on there that you can enjoy. So that was kind of like the bonus song. It was meant to play second fiddle to the A side. The A side, that's the song that's meant to be commercially viable. That's the song that's meant to do well, that you buy, that you listen to, that you enjoy. But there have been certain instances in history where this A side, B side formula hasn't worked. So American soul singer Sam Cooke, in 1964, so nearly 60 years ago, he released a song called Shake. And I don't expect any of you, has anybody heard that song by Sam Cooke called Shake, just before I make any assumptions? No, I didn't expect anybody to have heard or even heard of that song called Shake. It was the A-side single, but most people don't know it. But the B-side to that song was a song called A Change Is Gonna Come. And some of you may be familiar. That song goes, I was born by a river in a little tent. Oh, like that river I've been running ever since. That song has consistently been voted one of the best songs ever. So in like a whole host of like music periodicals and journals and music magazines and music journalists, this song consistently gets voted one of the best songs ever. In fact, Rolling Stone magazine, which is like a worldwide music magazine, one of the most respected music magazines in the world, they in the last couple of years compiled a list of the 500 best songs of all time based on all of their journalists kind of giving their input. And this song was voted the 3rd greatest song of all time. It was a song that came out, was written during the civil rights movement in the United States, and it was one of those songs that really took on the whole movement. Now, this monumental song started life as the B-side to a song that most of us have never even heard of, let alone heard. Because sometimes, in some rare instances, the B-side would take on a life of its own, and it would actually end up superseding the A-side. But it's important that we understand that that was never meant to be the case. When that happens, something has gone wrong, because the A-side is always meant to overshadow the B-side. Now, the Apostle Paul, he knows a thing or two about one thing superseding another thing. You see, he spent the 2nd chapter of his life as a converted Christian trying to supersede the 1st chapter of his life when he did some challenging things. And Paul he's very transparent, he openly has things that he wished that he could change about himself. There's a very famous passage in Romans, the letter to the Romans in the New Testament, in which he speaks about hating some of the things that he does and wishing that he didn't do those things, wishing he could stop doing those things, but just feeling powerless to do anything about it, feeling powerless to stop doing the things that he doesn't like. Does anybody here have any personality traits, any behaviors, any ways of being that you're not particularly keen on? Does anyone have any things that you wish that you could change about yourself, things that you don't really like? Yeah, thank you for being honest. I could ask anyone if anyone feels bold enough to share, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot like that. But let me ask this. Is anyone here stubborn? Yeah? Okay. Is anybody a procrastinator? Ah, okay. So maybe leave that assignment till the day before it's due, right? Even asking for a bit of an extension on a deadline. Is anybody impulsive? So sometimes you just act too fast. Yeah? Okay. Does anybody have no filter? So talk first, think later, and maybe say some things that you regret. Yeah? Is anybody overly sensitive? The reason I ask you these specific things, I think I fall into every single one of these categories. So, okay. Does anybody wish that they could change some of these things about themselves? Thank you for being honest. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he doesn't give us any specifics about what the things in his life that he wished he didn't do are. He doesn't give us any specifics, but I think if you look at some of the situations that he finds himself in, I think that you'll find that he actually struggles with some of the same things as us. Now, in his letter to the Galatians, and I'll ask for the first slide to be put on the screen, in his letter to the Galatians, Paul talks about how he joined the church leadership and how he carved out a role for himself. And he says this in Galatians chapter 2. He says, "And from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel for the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter, making him an apostle to the circumcised, also worked through me and sending me to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." Now look at the first verse. Look at the first thing that he says. Those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders. What they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. A little bit salty, Paul. Are you perhaps picking up a hint of someone who maybe has no filter? Someone who maybe doesn't always moderate the things that he says? A little bit lacking in diplomacy? So let me break down what's happening here. Paul is recapping the different responsibilities within the church leadership structure. Now, I know that there are theologians in our midst, and you guys might be very aware of what's happening here, but I'm just going to walk through this. So what Paul does, he mentions James and Cephas and John. Now, the James that he mentions, this isn't the disciple James, brother of John, the sons of thunder. It's not that James. This James is James, the younger brother of Jesus. He come to be known as James the Just. He was the first leader of the church. Cephas, who he mentions, Cephas is the Aramaic version of the name Peter. Just like the name Peter in French, for example, sounds different, Pierre instead of Peter. In Aramaic, it sounds different again. And Aramaic was one of the languages spoken by the Jews. John is just John. There's only one John, is him. So Paul is saying, James, Cephas, and John, they recognized Barnabas and myself as being called by God, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship. In other words, they formally welcomed us into the church. We still use that expression now. When someone is baptized, we say we extend them the right hand of fellowship. It's a way of saying that they're welcomed into the church. And Paul says they agreed that they would continue spreading the gospel amongst the circumcised, amongst the Jewish diaspora, amongst the Jewish people, wherever they find themselves in the world. And Barnabas and I, we would spread the gospel to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish world. So Paul has his job, the others have their job, and it's all good so far. But not for long. If I can have the second slide. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. Oh dear. What's happened, Paul? For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So let me explain what's happening. Historically, the Jewish people had lived lives entirely separate from the Gentiles, from the non-Jews, because God had given them, a long time ago, he'd given them guidance for how to avoid losing the essence of who they were and becoming like other people. But over the generations, they'd allowed this instruction to lead them to have what I guess we'd have to call a superiority complex. So they went from thinking, we're different from a purpose, to thinking, we're better than you. You're beneath us. But then, thank God, Jesus came along and Jesus teaches his apostles, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So Jesus is making clear and continues to make it clear that regardless of where anyone is from, regardless of the country of origin, their language, their race, their ethnicity, their passport, regardless of any of that, they are baptized into God the same way, which represents equality. But old habits die hard. And when certain things are inculcated in us, are ingrained in us, particularly from a young age, particularly when we're kids, in our formative years, when these things are really ingrained in us, it can be very hard to let them go. And so that's how it was for some of the Jewish Christians, even the leaders. They had these biases that were just like really hard baked in. And so in the church, originally you had the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians sitting together, talking together, eating lunch, breakfast, dinner together, just eating, no division. But then a group of Jewish Christians turns up. So these are people who are Christians, but Jewish in ethnicity and culture, and they turned up, and Paul refers to them as the circumcision faction. They sound ominous. They sound like a power base, like a caucus, like every organization, even the church, everywhere has these kind of power bases who like to think that they pull the strings and they can kind of manipulate things according to their own agendas. And so this circumcision faction turns up, and these are people that still have these very strong biases. And I don't know if it was something that they said to Peter or if they just turned up and stood in the corner and gave a look, because you know looks can be powerful. But there's something that they did that makes Peter begin to feel away, makes Peter begin to feel uncomfortable about eating with the Gentile Christians. And so Peter now starts to separate himself. And because he's a leader, without even needing to say anything, his actions are influential. And I'll be honest with you, because some of you here are going to go into positions of leadership, this can be quite a difficult lesson to learn. Sometimes you can just be doing something that in your mind is totally innocent, but as leaders, people still look and interpret what you're doing through a different lens to you might actually be trying to do it. And that's what's happening here to Peter. Peter is doing something, and without even realizing it, his actions are influential. And no doubt, like some of the people are watching, like, have you clocked? Like, Peter isn't really mixing with these guys anymore. Like, he used to sit with everyone, and now he's only sitting with these people over here. Yeah, I did clock that. I thought it was just me. You noticed that as well? Man, maybe we need to withdraw too. Maybe we need to kind of separate ourselves a little bit too. And so gradually, other people begin following this lead. And Paul, he sees what's happening, he's able to understand, and he realizes that this is actually really, really dangerous, because the power of the gospel is rooted in the idea that we are all equal in God's sight. Nobody is worse than anybody else. Nobody gets to be better than anybody else. We're all the same in God's eyes. So what does Paul do? Of the many ways to tackle this particular issue, which option does Paul pick? Well, he publicly calls Peter out. He says, I opposed him to his face. I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now, the principle is sound. It really is. Like, this kind of snobbery from the Jewish Christians really had the potential to irreparably damage the church at this fledgling, really early stage of its development. The principle is sound. But the method? Come on, Paul. You didn't have to do him like that, Paul. You didn't have to do him like that, Paul. To publicly stand up and declare in the presence of everybody, you're wrong. Danilo, you're wrong. I've seen what you're doing. You're wrong. You stand condemned. Aye, aye, aye. There are different ways to go about this. Like, Paul, you could approach him after lunch and just put an arm around his shoulder and just be like, look, Peter, this isn't right. You of all people know this isn't right. You had a vision from God showing you that we're all meant to come together and these previous kind of barriers don't exist anymore. You know this isn't right. So maybe at dinner time, just go and sit down with some of the Gentile brothers and we can try and kind of repair some of these wounds. Or they could make a joint statement together. We live in a day and age where people love releasing statements, right? They could release a statement. They could stand up in front of everyone and Paul could say, look, I was speaking with Peter and we realized how easy it is to fall into old ways of thinking without even meaning to do it. And we both kind of realized that as church leadership, we've fallen a little bit below the standards that we think that you deserve to hold us to. We just want to acknowledge that. And we just want to move forward to the vision that we have for God's church. How amazing would that be? That would be so cool for people to see, wow, even leaders get it wrong sometimes. And when they get it wrong, they own their mistakes. That would be like a really good example. Or Paul could even just have a chat with some of the elders and be like, look, guys, we're not sending the best message here. We don't need to make a big deal about it. Let's all of us go and sit with someone different over dinner, like mix with people that you haven't mixed with for a little while, and we can send that cue to people that it is okay and we should be mixing together. There's a number of ways you could go about kind of trying to heal this. You don't have to go straight to publicly humiliating someone, Paul. That doesn't have to be the first resort. I'll be honest with you, I've been Peter in this situation. Like, where as a church leader, someone thinks that you've done something wrong, there's something that you've done or something that you haven't done that they're unhappy about, and so they wait until the most high-profile time and place possible, and then they take aim at you. I can tell you, it doesn't feel great. And the funny thing is, Jesus himself even gives us counsel about how to act in these situations. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says, first of all, if someone in the church does something that you think is inappropriate or something that makes you unhappy, something that's wrong, what you do, you go and you take them to one side and you're like, brother, like, I've seen what you've done. I think we can do better. I think there are things that we can change here, so I just want to encourage you. Let's try and kind of change things a little bit. And Jesus says if that doesn't work, then the second thing you do, you bring a couple of the other people from the church, a couple of respected people, maybe the elders, whoever it may be, and you go back to that person again and you say, look, like, I just want to make it clear, this isn't personal. We're kind of representing the church, but we want to do things like in a delicate way. We want to respect your feelings, but we need to make some changes here. And Jesus says if that still doesn't work, then you deal with it in the presence of the church. But what does Paul do? He goes straight to DEFCON 1. You stand condemned. A very public rebuke of one of the most senior people in the church. Interestingly, he doesn't include anything about the response or the fallout from this particular dressing down. Maybe there wasn't enough room in the manuscript to include that part. Now, I want to stress, the principle is right. But what message does this send to the new members of the church, people who are new to Christianity, new to the faith? What message does this send to them about how to deal with conflict? What message does this send to them about if they make a mistake? Can you imagine how they're going to feel around Paul now? Like anytime they see Paul coming, like, oh, have I got anything on me? Oh my gosh, oh my gosh. If you are watching this happen, if you are watching this unfold, I can see how you might think that Paul has been a little bit heavy-handed in his dealing of this particular issue. Like, Paul, sometimes you're just a little bit too blunt, a little bit too outspoken, like always the one to stand up and speak out, no matter if it feels like the right time or place. Or Paul, sometimes you're just a little bit too inflexible and stubborn. I mean, yes, the principle is right, but sometimes there are other factors to consider than simply the principle of the matter. Like, down a gear, Paul. Can you not be a narc like just one time? The truth is, if you read through Paul's letters in the New Testament, particularly 1st and 2nd Corinthians come to mind, I actually don't think that Paul can turn off being blunt and outspoken. I'm actually not sure that Paul can stop being so uncompromising. There are a number of other people throughout the Pauline letters that get both barrels. They get an earful, they get told off, they get really seen to. There are some situations, including some people, that get called out in no uncertain terms, which kind of leads me to think, I just think that's the way that Paul is wired. It must be a bit challenging to be around sometimes. Like, imagine Paul's your friend. Like, you're going to love him, but sometimes you're going to be like, Paul, sometimes it's just a little bit much sometimes, bro. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe even Paul himself sometimes goes home of an evening and thinks, I was a little bit much today. I was a bit too heavy-handed. Maybe Paul himself even wishes that he could change some of these aspects of his personality that can make things challenging for him. Maybe these are actually some of the things that make him look in the mirror and say to himself, I keep doing the things that I don't like, and I wish I could change these things, but I just feel powerless. Because it's easy to get despondent. It's easy. This might not be your issue, but you can probably identify with that feeling. I've done it again. I said it again. It's easy to feel this way when you see the sides of yourself that you don't really like. And we all see the sides of ourselves that we don't really like. But if you read through the book of Acts, you see something else. Paul might seem a bit much when he says what's on his mind, regardless of the consequences of his actions. But this is the same man who, when he would be told by various friends that they had all had visions or messages from God individually, that he would get arrested and thrown in jail if he went back into Jerusalem, this is the same Paul who said, so what? I'm not ready to just get arrested for Jesus. I'm ready to go there and die for Jesus. Because in different circumstances, not thinking about the consequences of your actions can become not being afraid of the consequences of your actions. I mean, Paul might seem a bit too blunt and a bit too outspoken when he publicly berates Peter, but this is the same man who would be arrested in Jerusalem for being a Christian, and when he would be brought before the chief priests and the high council, the most powerful men in society who literally have the power of life and death over him, and when they would call for his head, this is the same Paul who would publicly berate these powerful men and would say to them, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting there to judge me? Because in different circumstances, being blunt and outspoken can become being courageous and lion-hearted. Paul might seem inflexible and stubborn when dealing harshly with Peter, but when a group of men would swear an oath that they would kill him for spreading the gospel, and when these hired contract killers would say, "We will not eat or drink until the brother is dead," and when the safest thing would be to keep a low profile and to lay low and to stay out of sight and to not be visible to protect your skin, this same Paul would publicly go to the governor and would say to him, "I appeal to the emperor's tribunal." And this is the highest profile court of the land. And he would say, "Take me to Caesar, because it's not enough for me to speak these things in front of the Jews. I don't even care about these guys. I demand to speak these things in the presence of the most powerful man in the world, and I will declare that Jesus is Lord, and let the cards fall where they may." Because in different circumstances, being inflexible and stubborn can become being steely and resolute. And so if Paul isn't the blunt, outspoken, stubborn, inflexible church leader, then I don't think he can be the courageous, lion-hearted, steely, resolute advocate for Jesus. Being unafraid to call out Peter comes from the same place as being unafraid to preach to the emperor of the world. And so I don't think that you can have one without the other. These qualities are like two sides of a coin. It's like the A side and the B side. Like they coexist with one another. The things that sometimes must make Paul a bit challenging to be around are residuals of the way that God has made him for his mission in life. And so Paul the Narc is actually Paul the defender of the faith, Paul the crusader, Paul who puts it all on the line no matter the cost. And the benefit of the A side far outweighs the cost of the B side. It's just about where you focus. Now, we don't know what Peter's reaction to Paul was. We don't have any record of it. I do feel pretty confident that at a certain point in Peter's life, his reaction would 100% have escalated this situation. I reckon it would have come to physical blows. I don't know. Because Peter was quite the reactive character. I mean, when Jesus was telling the disciples that one day he would be arrested and crucified, Peter's like, "No, Lord, I won't allow it. This will never happen on my watch." He's reactive. And when Jesus would say, "I need to wash your feet," he's like, "You'll never wash my feet." And then Jesus is like, "Well, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part on me. Wash my head, shoulders, knees, toes, wash everything, Lord." He's like over the top. And when people would come to arrest Jesus, he'd take out a sword and chop a man in his ear. He's wild. Peter's impulsive. He would speak first, think later. He'd act first, think later. He's got a whole lot of B-side. And that's probably all of the stuff that you and I would first observe and first notice when we see him. And that's the stuff that we would allow to define who he is in our mind. But in the Gospel of John, Jesus meets Peter when he's still called by his government name, Simon. And according to John's Gospel, the very first time that Jesus meets him, Jesus says to him, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Peter." And Peter means rock. And being called a rock is only ever a compliment. If a friend or a loved one says to you, "You are a rock," you know that's something good. You know that means they value you, they respect you, they rely on you. It's like Jesus is saying to Peter, people will look at you and they will see someone who's reactive. I see someone who's ready to roll for the cause at any given time. People will look at you and they're going to see someone who's over the top. I see someone who's animated and energetic and passionate. People will look at you and they might see someone who's brutish and wild. I see someone who is a defender and a protector of the vulnerable. So the B-side is there. There's no doubts about it. And I'm going to help you manage it. But it doesn't define you. Your A-side qualities will define you. So I'm calling you Rocky, aka Peter. Jesus wants everybody who encounters Peter to see his A-side before anything else, so much so that he puts it in his name. But more importantly, I think, it's like Jesus wants Peter to see it himself. It's like Jesus wants Peter to believe in himself, to see the good in himself, to not be distracted by the negative qualities, to not be distracted by the B side, but to always think first about the A side, so that every time Peter would introduce himself to somebody, he's reminded, Jesus thinks I'm a rock. That's got to make you feel 10 feet tall. There are traits that you have that probably seem frustrating to you. They almost certainly seem annoying to other people. But those traits might just be the B side of God-given qualities that equip you to extend the kingdom. God doesn't want your B side to overshadow the A side. He doesn't want the B side to become the surprise hit while the A side disappears into obscurity and no one ever hears of it again. So is anyone here stubborn? That's just the B side. I see someone who can dig their heels in and stand firm in the face of nonsense, like when the world is telling you that up is down and down is up, and things about humanity that have stood for millennia are actually wrong. Someone who won't be moved in spite of the current of the world. Is anyone here a procrastinator? It's just the B side. I see someone who can do a lot of good things at short notice. Someone who can be ready to serve God, to serve the church, to serve their class, to serve their community at the last minute when a need arises because you're used to doing it. Anyone here talk first and think later? It's just the B side. I see someone who can stand up to the bullies of this world. Someone who can say things that others need to say and should say and could say, but don't say because they're scared to say. Anyone here overly sensitive? It's just the B side. I see someone who can empathize deeply. Someone who at all times is thinking about how other people might be feeling. Someone who can tap into deeply meaningful ways to connect with other people. Someone who's compassionate. Don't ever think that your B side is the sum total of who you are. Because focusing on your B sides, that's like getting a nice, juicy bunch of grapes and then picking off and throwing away the grapes and then eating the brown stalky bit. You can't have one without the other, but you focused on the wrong bit. That bit will choke you. The other bit will nourish you. Focusing on your B side will only ever lead to you being half alive. And it's not the good half. Understanding your A side empowers you to be fully alive. Seeing your A side is actually the key to understanding how Jesus sees you. It means looking at yourself through a divine lens. Because when Jesus looks at Peter and he gives him this A-side name, he's still the same guy. He's still the guy who's wild and reactive and over the top and all of these things. He still has that B-side. But Jesus is giving him a glimpse into how he views him. He's trying to teach him, and by extension, trying to teach us how to view ourselves the way that he views us. Jesus looks at Peter, and he doesn't see a reactive wild man. He sees a rock. Jesus looks at Paul, and he doesn't see a blunt, stubborn know-it-all. He sees a super apostle. Jesus looks at you, and he sees your true God-given strength, the A side. You might be very aware of your B side, so much so that that might just fully influence your focus and make you think that that's all that you are. Simply use your B side as a mirror to show you your A side. Flip the paradigm. God has given you qualities to make you a champion. There are certain things about yourself that you probably cannot change. But if you're willing, they will show you the things about yourself that equip you to change your world. So let's flip those B sides. And let's live out those A sides the way that God made us to be, fully alive.